Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Edwin, a clinical audiologist from Otic Hearing and Speech Center, and also today's MC. Welcome to Otic Hearing and Speech Center Professional Online Summit 2021. We believe that the general population would not be surprised to hear that hearing loss is a highly prevalent condition in older adults. It has been reported that untreated hearing loss is associated with poor balance and for related injuries, social isolation, and depression, etc. One of the treatments for hearing loss is the use of hearing aid. Oticon launched an innovative hearing aid MORE earlier this year. The neural network is a unique feature in this model. Today, we are delighted to welcome our honorable speaker, Dr. Nicole Armstrong and Dr. Douglas Beck to our seminar to share their knowledge and views on hearing loss, dementia, and disability, and the concepts and application of deep neural networks in the latest Oticon hearing aid MORE, respectively. If you have any questions regarding the presentations, please type it in the chat box. Our speakers will answer them after their presentation. For our first presentation, we are pleased that you have Dr. Nicole Armstrong to share her presentation. Who is listening? Hearing impairment as a risk factor for dementia and disability. Dr. Nicole Armstrong is a PhD trained epidemiologist in the area of aging. She is now working as an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior, Robert Alpert Medical School, Brown University. Her current work focuses on changes in cognition and brain structure as a function of hearing impairment. Dr. Armstrong, please.
Thank you for the introduction, Edwin. So as Edwin mentioned, I am currently an assistant professor of psychiatry and human behavior at the Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University. I also serve as an associate director of quantitative sciences program of the department and the associate director of the design and analysis core of the Center of Biomedical Research Excellence on Neuromodulation at Butler Hospital. And today I will be talking about hearing loss as a risk factor for both dementia and disability. Here's a brief overview of the presentation. First, I will discuss why hearing loss is a public health issue. Then I will talk about the relationship of hearing loss with dementia and disability, specifically mobility disability and disability involving activities of daily living. And lastly, I will provide a summary of the overall talk and future directions. So I actually pre-recorded the talk because the internet connection that I currently have is sometimes unstable, and I've been disconnected and reconnected with Zoom a few times during a previous presentation that I gave. So in order to avoid all that, in case it does happen, the pre-recorded video is to ensure that there's no interruption with any sort of connection issues that I might have on my end. And then I'll come back at the end for the question and answer period. The title of my talk is Who is Listening? Hearing Impairment as a Risk Factor for Dementia and Disability. I have no conflicts of interest or disclosures to report. Here's a brief overview of my talk. First, I will talk about how hearing loss is a major public health issue. After that, I will then discuss why hearing loss is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias and incident disability, specifically mobility disability and disability in activities of daily living, otherwise known as ADLs. Then I'll conclude with a summary and future directions. Why is hearing loss a major public health issue? In the US, there are 38.2 million Americans aged 12 years or older who have hearing loss. This represents 14.3% of the US population. And you can see in this graphic here, there are age decades. And as the age decade increases, the number of people with hearing loss also increases. If we look at adults aged 50 to 59 years, 1 in 10 has some degree of hearing loss. And then if we compare this to adults age 80 years and older, we see that 8 and 10 have some degree of hearing loss. What do I mean by hearing loss? I'm talking about peripheral auditory dysfunction. But what is peripheral auditory function? Peripheral auditory function is characterized by transduction and encoding of sound in the cochlea. Sensory neural hearing loss occurs when sound waves are not processed correctly. So this is attributed to hair cells inside of the cochlea dying as we age, and hair cells are not regenerated. So this creates a muffling of the sound as it's being transducted to the nerve and processed in the brain. Central auditory function is the processing of that sound and it being integrated, associated, analyzed, and having attention paid towards it. So this is all being processed, the sound is being processed by the brain. Peripheral auditory dysfunction has been recently recognized as a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. It is highly prevalent in older adults. About 2/3 of older adults aged 70 years and older have some degree of hearing loss. However, it can be improved with peripheral amplification, such as hearing aids. Central auditory dysfunction could be a prodromal symptom of Alzheimer's disease, since it has been detected in patients with mild cognitive impairment, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease. It has also been associated with executive dysfunction independent of memory impairment. And executive function is, and it entails working memory, inhibition, and that sort of thing. So for the presentation, I'll be focusing on peripheral auditory dysfunction, otherwise known in this case as hearing loss. How do we assess peripheral auditory function? Well, this is assessed through pure tone audiometric screening tests. So you hear a sound in the ear, and then you raise your hand in correspondence to which side you heard that sound on. And those sounds and responses are recorded on something called an audiogram, which probably everyone in this audience is familiar with. On the x-axis here, we have pitch or frequency. So we have low pitch, which is a faucet dripping, all the way to high pitch, which is a bird chirping. On the y-axis, we have loudness, and this could be a faucet dripping as low sounds and a rock concert being very loud. And in the middle, we have the speech banana. And this is where most of human speech lies. So the pure tone average is an average of the hearing threshold levels at a set of specified frequencies, 500, 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000 hertz. Hearing loss has also been connected to a number of adverse outcomes, such as cardiovascular disease, depression and loneliness, falls, chronic kidney disease, mortality, hospitalizations, diabetes, disability, and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. For the talk today, I will be focusing on the last two adverse outcomes, disability and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. What is the relationship between hearing loss and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias? First, what is Alzheimer's disease? It is a neurodegenerative disorder that can start 20 years prior to any symptom onset. It's characterized by 3 phases: a preclinical phase, a mild cognitive impairment stage or phase, and a dementia phase. The preclinical phase is where there's changes happening in the brain. The individual might sense that there is a change going on, but there are no diagnostic tests to actually pinpoint the change. Mild cognitive impairment involves disruption to one or more cognitive domains. Typically, it's memory, but it could be a different cognitive domain. But activities of daily living are still intact. And dementia is characterized by having both impairments to one or more cognitive domains and activities of daily living. The Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention, Intervention, and Care released 2 reports, and these are on risk factors throughout the life course of dementia. And here, for instance, in midlife, we see that hearing loss has been identified as a modifiable risk factor for dementia with the greatest population attributable risk. So this is the percentage reduction in dementia prevalence if we eliminated hearing loss. However, there are a couple caveats here. These caveats are there is no confounding or other bias, and there's presence of causation. So hearing loss has to be a cause of dementia. There are also differences that I would like to point out between men and women. So I mentioned before that hearing loss, the prevalence seems to increase per decade of age. Well, the prevalences of hearing loss also differ between men and women. Men typically experience hearing loss starting at age 30, while women typically experience hearing loss around age at menopause. It is thought that estrogen may provide a protective effect against hearing loss. However, it is very difficult to study the estradiol cycle since it's very complex. There was a paper published using guinea pigs, but this is the only study that I know to knowledge or to date that has actually evaluated the estradiol cycle and how it leads to hearing loss in women, or in female guinea pigs, I should say. So the objective of the study was to see whether hormone therapy modified the association between hearing loss and dementia. To do this, I used data from the Women's Health Initiative, and here's a little description about that. So starting in 1993, the hormone therapy study consisted of 2 separate trials in postmenopausal women aged 50 to 79 years at baseline. So women without hysterectomy were randomized to receive either estrogen or progestin versus placebo. Women with hysterectomy were randomized to receive either estrogen or placebo. And an ancillary study to this was conducted from 1995 to 2009, and this was to examine the association of the hormone therapy intervention with cognitive decline and dementia. The measures that were used in this particular study were self-reported hearing loss, defined as any hearing loss, mild, moderate, severe versus normal hearing. And this was measured before randomization. It was a question asked about how bothersome the symptom was during the past 4 weeks. Hormone therapy assignment was discussed on the previous slide, and baseline covariates included demographic characteristics, diabetes, hypertension, smoking status, and depressive symptoms. The outcomes of this particular study were change in global cognition and incident cognitive impairment. Change in global cognition was measured by z-scores of the total score of the modified mini mental state examination. These were standardized to the baseline mean and standard deviation. The method used was multivariable linear mixed effects models. Incident cognitive impairment was defined as the adjudicated diagnoses of either mild cognitive impairment or dementia. The method used was an accelerated failure time model. Here are the results for the first outcome. This is the association of hearing loss with change in global cognition over time. On the x-axis is years since baseline, so 0 is baseline, and 2 years would be 2 years from baseline. On the y-axis, we have the fitted mean difference in global cognition from baseline, and this is adjusted by all the covariates, and these numbers are in standard deviations. And of course, the study was stratified by the 2 hormone trial groups. Within the estrogen-only group, we see that there's really no difference in the trajectories. So both groups from 0 to 2 years had an increase, which is probably indicative of a practice effect. From years 2 to 4, since baseline, there's a plateau. And then from year 4 down to year 10, there is a steep decline in both groups. And the p-values here represent the log rank tests, which examine the differences between normal hearing and hearing loss. So there was no difference between these two groups, whereas in the estrogen progestin group, there was a difference. And we can see this starting in year 6, where the hearing loss group had a steeper decline in global cognition than the normal hearing group. Here are the results from the associations of hearing loss and hormone therapy with incident cognitive impairment. So the unadjusted and adjusted results don't really look that much different from each other. Again, this was stratified by trial, since the women with hysterectomies and the women without hysterectomies had different baseline characteristics. And we see here that there were no associations between hearing loss and incident cognitive impairment within the estrogen alone trial. Whereas in the estrogen progestin trial, we did see that hearing loss was associated with a 7% faster rate of onset of incident cognitive impairment than normal hearing. And hormone therapy assignment was also associated with an 8% faster onset of incident cognitive impairment as compared to being randomized to placebo. There were 175 with MCI in the estrogen alone trial and 92 with dementia in the estrogen alone trial, and 226 with MCI dementia in the estrogen alone trial. In the estrogen progestin trial, you see that there are 167 with MCI, 130 with dementia, and 255 with MCI dementia status. What are the potential explanations for these results? Well, women who reported hearing loss prior to randomization had lower baseline global scores than women with normal hearing, especially in those with prior hysterectomies. Women with low scores may already be vulnerable to neuronal injury. Hearing loss may have contributed an additional hit or neuronal injury. Estrogen and progestin is associated with procoagulants and pro-inflammatory markers, which are associated with vascular disease outcomes. And these outcomes can trigger a cascade of downstream neuronal injuries that can result in the onset of cognitive impairment. So now that I've shown you the association between hearing loss and incident dementia, I now want to get to this question, which comes first? Is it hearing or is it cognition? And this question came from the American Geriatric Society and National Institute on Aging Bench to Bedside Conference on Sensory Impairment and Cognitive Decline in Older Adults. The question was, which comes first? Changes in hearing, vision, olfaction, or cognition? And to what degree are the relationships bidirectional, or do they arise concurrently? The objective of this particular study was to determine whether the level of hearing status is associated with change in cognition 2 years after baseline or vice versa. The hypothesis was that baseline hearing status is associated with cognitive decline 2 years after baseline, but baseline cognition is not associated with change in hearing status 2 years after baseline. The data came from the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging. It is the longest running study of physical and psychological aging in the United States. It was first initiated in 1958 by Dr. Nathan Schock. Women have been studied since 1978. Hearing assessments occurred from 1990 to 1994, and then again in 2012 to present day. And the neuroimaging program and standardization of the neuropsychological test battery started around 1994. And the reason why I'm going through detail of the BLSA, as it's abbreviated, is because I will be presenting other studies with results from the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging. So back to the question, which comes first? Here is a graphical representation of the question. So you see that this is an autoregressive cross-lagged model. And the hypothesis is detailed in this particular figure. The dotted line means no significance, and the arrows mean significance in terms of the associations. The sample for this particular study consisted of 313 non-demented participants aged 60 years and older with hearing and neuropsychological assessments starting in 2012 and 2 years thereafter. Cognition, which was the Z-scores of individual tests, was measured by the following individual tests: trail making tests parts A and B, California Verbal Learning Test, Mini Mental State Examination, Benton Visual Retention Test, Digit Symbol Substitution Test, and Digit Span Forwards and Backwards. We found that baseline poor peripheral auditory processing is associated with decreases in memory and attention 2 years later. However, cognitive functioning is not associated with change in hearing status. So these results actually supported our hypothesis, and this figure actually held. This brings me to the conceptual framework. So how is hearing loss associated with cognitive impairment and dementia? Well, there are a few hypothesized mechanisms. These mechanisms include cognitive load, changes in brain structure and function, and social isolation. Or there could be a common pathological process that causes both hearing loss and cognitive impairment and dementia. So this leads me to the next question. Is hearing loss associated with changes in brain volumes? So going back to the Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention, Intervention, and Care report, hearing loss was identified as being a risk factor in midlife. The justification for this was provided in the article in the 2017 version. The quote is, "We have used the prevalence of hearing loss in individuals older than 55 years to calculate the population attributable factor because this age was the youngest mean age in which the presence of hearing loss was shown to increase dementia risk." This is how midlife hearing loss was determined through these 3 studies. The first study, Lin et al. 2011, used participants from the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging who ranged in age from 36 to 90, with it being skewed more towards older adults, age 60 years and older. The Gallagher et al. 2012 study used data from the Caird-Philly cohort, which consisted of men only, and the mean age was 56.1 years with a standard deviation of 4.4 years. Deal et al. 2016 used data from the Health, Aging, and Body Composition study, where the participants ranged from 70 to 79 years of age at baseline. So it seems like it's not really a midlife factor. It's more of a late life factor. So now this led me to look at midlife hearing loss being associated with changes in brain structure. So it's unclear whether midlife or late life hearing impairment or loss is associated with late life volume loss in temporal lobes. Hearing impairment is associated with longitudinal volumetric declines in whole brain and regional volumes in the right temporal lobe in older adults. So in order to conduct the study, I used multivariable linear mixed effects models, and the fixed effects consisted of the midlife hearing measure, which was pure tone average, between the years of 1990 and 1994, baseline intracranial volume to adjust for head size, sex, cognitive status, baseline age, educational level, and time since first MRI in later life. There were two-way interactions between PTA, or pure tone average, sex, baseline age, and cognitive status with time since first MRI. Baseline occurred between 2008 to 2015, and follow-up ranged from 1 to 6 years with a mean of 1.4 years and a standard deviation of 1.7 years. Here are the results. So here are images of the brain structures from an MRI. This is an individual's MRI. And these values are T values from the measure of pure tone average by time. So this is looking at the change in the volume by pure tone average, by 10 decibel increase of pure tone average. So what the colors mean, so the pink areas or the red areas indicate less steep volumetric declines. The white areas indicate no volumetric change, and the blue areas indicate steeper volumetric declines. So wherever you see deep blues in this image, there were steeper volumetric declines. The results for that poor midlife hearing was associated with steeper late life volumetric declines in right temporal gray matter, which you see here, or right hippocampus, and left entorhinal cortex. The hippocampus and entorhinal cortex are structures implicated in early Alzheimer's disease pathology. Then I conducted a separate study examining the association of poorer hearing with change of white matter microstructure. There hadn't been a study examining poorer hearing with longitudinal change in white matter microstructure before. So I thought it would be interesting to see if if hearing was associated with change of white matter microstructure. So the objective was to determine whether poor peripheral auditory function was associated with baseline and/or change in white matter microstructure. And the hypothesis was that poor peripheral and central auditory function are associated with declines of white matter microstructure, especially in tracts associated with hearing and language, such as superior longitudinal fasciculus, inferior frontal occipital fasciculus, and the uncinate fasciculus. However, in the results I'm showing, I'm only going to be focusing on peripheral auditory function and not central auditory function. The method used was linear mixed effects models, and these were adjusted by age, sex, race, and presence of vascular risk factors. And here's a figure taken from the paper. There were 356 BLSA participants with both hearing assessments and DTI measures between the years of 2012 and 2018. The teal here represents the body of the corpus callosum, and the violet here indicates the inferior frontal occipital fasciculus. And these regions of interest came from the Eve White Matter Atlas, and they're superimposed on a T1 weighted image. So there were no baseline associations with the diffusion tensor imaging metrics, and diffusion tensor imaging is what measures white matter microstructure. So there's two metrics of interest for DTI. The first is fractional anisotropy, and this quantifies the directionality of the water diffusion. And then there's mean diffusivity, which quantifies the magnitude of water diffusion within brain tissue. When white matter structures become damaged or decline, fractional anisotropy reduces as the directional order imposed is lost, and mean diffusivity increases as there are fewer barriers restricting the overall magnitude of diffusion. So in this case, we found longitudinally that poor peripheral hearing was associated with increases in mean diffusivity in the inferior frontal occipital fasciculus and the body of the corpus callosum, but there were no associations of peripheral hearing with fractional anisotropy changes in these tracts. Here are some potential explanations. The inferior frontal occipital fasciculus includes two subcomponents, the superficial layer and the deep layer. The superficial layer is involved in bridging the semantic memory with verbal systems, and the deep layer is involved in object semantic processing, since it projects into the fusiform gyrus and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And it has been suggested that hearing loss is also associated with volumetric declines in fusiform gyrus, suggesting that poor peripheral auditory function may affect the inferior frontal occipital fasciculus through its connection with the fusiform gyrus. Although we didn't see that with a midlife hearing and late life volume loss project, it has been reported in other studies that there is this association between hearing loss and the fusiform gyrus. So what is the relationship with hearing loss and incident disability? Now I'm going to shift gears and actually focus on disability now. So hearing loss and depressive symptoms are both risk factors for mobility disability, which is defined as severe difficulty or inability to walk a quarter of a mile or climb one flight of stairs, and disability in activities of daily living. Activities of daily living include eating, bathing, getting dressed, toileting, and transferring. My hypothesis was that those with hearing loss and depressive symptoms have an even greater risk of disability than the other groups, which include those with either hearing loss or depressive symptoms and those with neither hearing loss nor depressive symptoms. The data came from the Health, Aging, and Body Composition study. This is an interdisciplinary study that was focused on risk factors for the decline of function in healthier older adults. Enrollment occurred between 1997 and 1998. The study ended in 2013, and the inclusion criteria consisted of difficulty walking a quarter of a mile or difficulty climbing 10 steps. Here are the results from this study. I used a multivariable Cox proportional hazards model to examine this relationship. So this model allows you to estimate the risk of time to event data, essentially. So we have the categories listed on the side. The degrees of hearing loss, so there's normal, mild hearing loss, and moderate severe hearing loss, and the absence of depressive symptoms, and then in the presence of depressive symptoms. And then here was an interaction term in a separate model looking at pure tone average and depressive symptoms. So if you look at these hazard ratios, they really don't differ between the absence or presence of depressive symptoms. So it led me to conclude that independent of depressive symptoms, risk of incident mobility disability and ADL disability was greater in older adults with hearing loss, regardless of severity. Now on to summary and future directions. How is hearing loss a risk factor for both dementia and disability? Hearing loss precedes cognitive decline. It is associated with global cognitive decline and late life volume loss in brain structures affected by early AD pathology, such as the entorhinal cortex and hippocampus. And it is also associated with decreases or declines in the frontal occipital fasciculus as well. It increases the risk of disability among community dwelling older adults, independent of depressive symptoms. And the significance, the public health significance of this is that hearing loss is a public health issue. It's highly prevalent in older adults, and it could potentially be treated or intervened upon by hearing aids, for instance. It is also a risk factor for both dementia and disability. Better understanding of the timing of hearing loss as a risk factor may increase awareness of better hearing care at earlier ages to potentially delay onset of dementia and disability. And hearing aids could be a potential late life intervention as well. Here are some potential avenues for exploration. Does midlife hearing loss increase risk of incident cognitive impairment and disability? Does social isolation, as we see here in this figure, partially mediate the association between hearing loss and cognitive impairment? Is it actually a hypothesized mechanism? There hasn't been that much work into that particular question. Does the presence of vascular damage explain the relationship between hearing loss and cognitive impairment, especially if it's a common cause? Are there sex differences present in these associations? The prevalence of dementia is higher in women than men, and then the prevalence of hearing loss is higher in men than women. So what does this mean? Can hearing aids actually modify the association between hearing loss and cognitive decline? And this last point is actually being studied currently. It's through the Aging and Cognitive Health Evaluation in Elders randomized controlled trial. It's called ACHIEVE for short. It's embedded in a prospective cohort study that was started in the late 1980s called the ERIC study. There's a one-to-one randomization to hearing intervention, which includes hearing needs assessment, fitting of hearing devices, and education and counseling, or to the placebo condition, which is successful aging intervention. And this involves individual sessions with a health educator covering healthy aging topics. The participants are followed semi-annually for 3 years, 6 months post-randomization. And the hope is that the study will address whether a late life hearing intervention may slow rates of brain volume loss and cognitive decline among cognitively normal older adults with hearing loss. And with that, I would like to conclude my talk. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators at the National Institute on Aging, Johns Hopkins University, and the University of Pennsylvania. The funding for these projects came from the National Institute on Aging Intramural Research Program, where I was a postdoctoral fellow doing a lot of these studies in the Laboratory of Behavioral Neuroscience. And I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions. And if you would like to follow up, I have my email listed on the slide.